he was a teacher, a farmer in Ohio County, which is about 75 miles, to the west of the park. And he made an excursion at that time where, if you think about, it was river traffic to get to Bowling Green to catch a train, to take a train up to Park City, or Glasgow Junction as it was called at that time, and then take a train from Park City out to out to the park. And so he brought all the teachers from Ohio County, and you can kind of imagine that that story and that journey lasted through generations in my family. So they talked about coming to Mammoth Cave even in the early days, before even the park. Wow. So in those days, there was a story about one of the teachers that came on this trip, and I guess this is why maybe this story lasted forever in our family. He was I guess considered a pontificator, if you will, and was a pretty good talker. And what he had done on that particular trip was he got the trip that he happened to be on, the cave tour that he happened to be on, delayed. He was talking to the trading guide so much that they would stop and talk and stop and talk, and the trip went on ahead of him. And turns out this particular guide that he wasn't quite sure what trail to take to get out of the cave. He was fairly new there. But so they ended up, that particular trip got delayed, waiting for the next trip. So what they had to do was just sit down and wait for the next trip to come by. And so their trip there, they had to stay an extra day, in the cave, and eventually got back to, and it was a good, couple of days journey to get back to Ohio County at that time. So they that story was told quite often. I know as a young person, when I grew up, they were still telling that story. And I can just remember it. And at that time we would, and I think my family, my father and mother, they were very interested in national parks. Always took us trips out west, to visit the major Yellowstone and Grand Canyons and Petrified Forest and those kind of things. And but I also recall, and I think it was about the time evidently Mission 66 was well underway, in the National Park Service from that period, 1956 to 1966.
What was Mission 66?
Well, it was an effort, obviously from the civilian conservation days, where they were developing national parks, and we had 4 camps here at Mammoth Cave to help develop the cave after it was actually initially brought in 1941. And so they had built roads and some buildings, and matter of fact, this building we're in doing this interview today was built by the Civilian Conservation Corps. Back during that time, it was a kind of a maintenance facility. So there was an effort, nationwide effort, to actually expand, realizing that the automobile was coming into play, people were traveling, roads were improving, that the infrastructure at parks needed to be improved. And so Mission 66 was that effort to build hotels, build visitor centers, build roads and facilities for visitors to come. So I'm almost thinking about the time that we started coming to Mammoth Cave was dealing with those, the construction of the visitor center. There was a lot of news media about this. We only lived. My father was a minister in the Cumberland Presbyterian Church, and so we didn't live too far away from Mammoth Cave. Although in those times there weren't the interstates weren't around. It was a journey to say come from Taylor County, which is about 70 miles further to the east, to get here. But we would stop by here, and I can remember coming to the hotel right after it opened and the visitor center to see the exhibits. And my mother was deathly afraid of caves. Didn't think anyone should go underground like that, but I thought otherwise, and we'd take cave tours. So I had an interest there. But when I went to college, my background was in geography, geology, with a heavy interest in meteorology. My grandfather was a cooperative weather observer for the county of Ohio County. Him and his father, my great grandfather, had been cooperative observers for 65 years. and would take daily weather observations and all these precipitation temperature, and submit that. So I just was fascinated, watching them, measure rainwater, check the temperature every day, and report it. And so when I first went into to college, my interest was in meteorology, and I studied that. And so my very first job coming out of college was actually with the National Weather Service. I was a weather communication specialist, and so my job was to get was to actually present weather over they wanted people with Kentucky accents to talk to Kentuckians, which was a huge mistake, because even a Kentuckian has a difficult time pronouncing cities and locations within the state that match up with a local dialect. Where it's Cairo or Cairo, the Illinois area, those kinds of things. But anyway, they hired us, and so I went to work there. And so from that point, I had, but I still had this interest in working with the Park Service. It was a job. This particular job I had was pretty much funded by the state of Kentucky in a combination with the National Weather Service, and it was a swing shift type of job where you had to you worked days one week, afternoons the next week, and then midnights the next week. And I realized right then maybe the Weather Service wasn't my cup of tea. So I applied for a job, a permanent position with it was open at Mammoth Cave. And wow, it brought back a lot of childhood memories of coming to the park. And so I put in for it. It was for a physical science technician position. They were someone had actually discovered the presence of radon gas inside Mammoth Cave, and they needed someone to take that job. Turns out I think I was the only applicant for the job. My stature is only 5'8", and I recall driving down. I applied for the job with through the civil service system, and got a call from Doyle Klein, who was the deputy superintendent at Mammoth Cave at that time in 1976, in September of 1976. And he said, "Come down for an interview." And I was pretty excited about that, so I drove down, and he met with me. And I remember Doyle was about 6'5", and he looked at me. He first looked at me and said, "You'll fit in well here." Mainly, and I didn't understand what he was talking about until after I had a chance to start touring the caves a little more in depth. That when you're 6'5" versus 5'8", you can make your way through the caves a little bit simpler. He said he lost many of his flat hats to rock ledges. So that was my first position. So I started here at 1976. And stayed in that position as a physical science technician up until 1989. Now, during that period, that was a period where lots of things were going on with radon gas being. It was initially found up in the Reading Prong of Pennsylvania. At that time, we were doing this nationwide survey of cave parks to try to find out, the presence or absence of radon in caves. So my job was to actually just assemble that data, and we were looking at all kinds of things. We were doing lots of research in terms of trying to understand what levels existed underground, what levels happened in some cases buildings and structures. We had a little bit of a unique situation here in the mid-1960s where a unique ventilation system had been developed for Mammoth Cave. They had drilled a shaft down to the cave to actually pull cave air up into the visitor center and administrative offices to air condition them. Well, unfortunately, inside that air was radon, so we were actually exposing most of the office staff and visitors. Not only they were getting radon exposure down in the cave, we were getting it up in the visitor center and offices. So we closed that off. We had to shut that down in the summer, July of 1976, just prior to when I arrived in October 11th, 1976. So we had, anyway, they had cut down, they'd sealed that up. They had, tried to do some other mitigating factors, but primarily my job was just to monitor every cave trail that we had people going into. So that meant not only park guides, park maintenance staff. We had a very, relatively large staff back in those days.
Different than today?
Yeah, a lot different than today. We had entire cave maintenance crews that would just stay underground. So they had to maintain the bathrooms, pick the garbage up off the trails, keep everything clean, keep potholes cut down. So they had staffs that just roamed the caves. They would go in at 7 in the morning and they'd come out at 4. We don't do that today. We don't have that kind of staff any longer. We had a lot more seasonal staff. In those days, we really didn't think about, in terms of interpretation, we didn't think about having limits on the number of people on tour. So if you had enough to go on a tour, it went. So you could have a lot of historic tours, because just as they filled up, if you got 200 people, you sent a trip off. So there was just this constant cycle of trips coming and going. So we had over 100 seasonal staff underground, in addition to some permanent staff that were guides throughout the year. So there was a major paperwork exercise of trying to understand, get the concentrations of radon in the cave, assemble all the exposure, all the hours of exposure, and then both for maintenance and interpretation. As a matter of fact, my exposure was right up there as some of the highest exposure, just because I was monitoring radon. I was down there most every day, all day, just doing radon measurements. And we were also doing research to try to look at caves that were off the main cave. We were looking at the outlying caves as well, trying to, again, research and understand the radon issue. Of course, found it in every cave we have, different levels. So that was, and then in by the mid 1980s, I had migrated. There was a bigger effort in looking at it in surface areas, in buildings. I mentioned earlier that the Reading Prong of eastern Pennsylvania, where they found some major radon in homes, and that led to a Park Service effort to actually measure. So that's what I did. I did a little bit of that, and not just here. We were fortunate that this sandstone cap that covers Mammoth Cave also prevents having the soils above it are a little bit minimal in the amount of radium and uranium that's in it. So we don't have buildings here outside of the ones that were attached to that ventilation shaft, pulling air from the cave up, was quite low. So I spent a lot of time traveling in the southeast. I worked at places like Everglades and Great Smokies, and working on mitigating buildings and houses and structures on radon exposure, try to reduce those.
Mm-hmm.
By 1989, I had an opportunity. There was a job application for an air quality specialist with the Air Resources Division. It's called the Air Quality Division at that time, but the Air Resources Division later in Denver. It was a Washington level job, and they needed some people with background in air quality monitoring, meteorological measurements, and I thought that really fit into what a little bit of my early years of working with meteorology and enjoying the study of meteorology.
So it would have been a step up, or a
yes, and it was a great increase. As a matter of fact, it was in the GS scales, where when I first entered here, GS4, it went to a GS5, it went to a GS7, and this was a GS9, GS11, GS12. It's kind of a training type of position. So from Denver, in the 6 years over there, I went from a GS9 to a GS12, staying as a what they call a monitoring specialist, which was quite fascinating. I got a chance to travel around the country. I mean, I was spending most of my time on the road, in the air, if you will, traveling. We had 42 parks. These are parks that are considered Class 1 airsheds, which is what Mammoth Cave is as well, too. It's only a Class 1 airshed in the state of Kentucky.
What does that mean?
Well, it's under the Clean Air Act. They established national, in any federal lands that were in excess of, especially Park Service lands, that were in excess of 6,000 acres. And they exceeded, they had a national park designation to the end of their name. Under the Clean Air Act, it was passed in 1970 and amended in 1977. They established that piece that deals with national parks and public lands, federal fish and wildlife service areas, forest service areas. that Class 1 designation meant you had the most pristine air in the country. It provided the greatest protection against the degradation from air pollution. So you would expect air to be clean in these Class 1 areas. And so the next question after 1977 was, well, what are the levels of air quality in these Class 1 areas? And nobody knew. There was really no monitoring going on here. Everything was population based. So, why monitor in a place that has few people? And so the Clean Air Act sort of allowed us the opportunity to get funding to actually monitor what it is. And so our focus has been all along is air quality impacts of a resource and not air quality impacts to the population. We leave that to the state of Kentucky, EPA, and other agencies like that. So our role is what is air pollution doing, to national parks, and in that terms of, when you go to a view shed, you would like to be able to see some distance, and you'd like to be able to see that all these trees are green, or there is a river down there, or something of some feature that you want to see, whether you're at the Grand Canyon or you're at the Great Smokies, or even if you're at Mammoth Cave. We don't have those tremendous view shades here, but we do still have some beautiful valleys, and if you go back and to look at the reason the park was established, so those are enabling legislations, if you will. Most of the time, that's what you go back to try to find out what is the importance of this particular park. And the hilly country and the scenic river valley was one of the elements, criteria for this park being established, in addition, obviously, to the cave, but the length of the cave and the size of the cave and just the cave itself. So that's the nexus, for air quality protection in parks. So from that we had, so Mammoth was one of the park's Smokies. So I travel across the country. I get to Arches, all these Class 1 air sheds, that we had. In some cases even Class 2 air sheds, which are something a little bit less. These are parks in urban areas, maybe, those kinds of things. Indiana Dunes comes to mind. They weren't quite Class 1 areas, but they did deserve some air quality protection, or we had some special funding. So I travel and spend a week at the station calibrating all the instrumentation, making sure that it met. We did that twice a year. And so I was in the airports just around the country, but it was nice airports, Hilo was not too bad in Hawaii, but then you were at Denali, for a little while in Alaska, or you went to Acadia, or you went to Virgin Islands, Everglades. So you were crisscrossing the country, time zone.
Did you have a family? You had a family?
Yes, we were my wife and I, who met at Mammoth Cave. We met here, married in 1979. So in 89 we had one child by the time we left Denver. In 1994 we had 3 children together. So we moved back. So after that experience, I applied for that's my first experience coming back to Mammoth Cave was because of Vicki, my wife, applied for a public information specialist job here, and then I came back here actually on a detail assignment with, and I worked based out of Mammoth Cave. I was doing air quality coordinator duties for the Southeast Regional Office. So I was kind of positioned here and working for a little bit of an entire region. The coordinator duties are more to the level of looking at permit activity, what types of monitoring are going on. You're a little more in just like I said, coordinator role, not more of actually an operational kind of role that you might have if you're at a park. By about 1996, I took on we decided that Mammoth Cave did not have the staff here to do some critical air quality monitoring that we needed to do in response to some national efforts to look at visibility issues, ozone issues, air pollution effects. And so the superintendent of the park here, which was Ron Schweitzer, decided we needed to have an air quality specialist here. So we worked out on an arrangement where I would actually be stationed at Mammoth Cave. And so about 1996 that started, and I've been here. I stayed the air quality specialist up until about 2010, excuse me. And then our chief for Science and Resource Management retired, and I went into an acting role, acting chief of Science and Resource Management until 2012, and they applied for the chief job and got the position that I hold today. So that's been my role, in the Park Service over the last now 38 years. So.
Right. Wow, it's changed, but it's evolved and seems like a very symbiotic kind of way.
Well, I always laugh. I probably had one of the few jobs, except this one now as chief, that I was monitoring things you couldn't see, smell, hear, taste. Not people would say, I spent my life working with radon or some some physical component of air, if you will, either meteorology or some function or some component of air. So.
Who would be your team in the science division? How many? I mean, how were you interacting with interpretation and law enforcement and all the people I'm getting to know?
Sure. Well, the way we're structured, we have an interpretation division, a maintenance division, and the Science and Resource Management division is kind of interesting. Of course, it was born in about 1989 is when the division really came into formation. At that time, resource management was performed in the Ranger Division at this park, and really only had one position that was really identified as a kind of collateral duty type of position. So he was a district ranger, or North District Ranger, and resource management specialist. From there, there was a period of time where we also brought some people on, and a little bit was due to radon. We actually needed to get people out of the cave. Their exposures were so high, and so we tried this kind of a split program, if you will, where the permanent staff would spend 3 months, in a cave, or 4 months in the cave, and then 4 months on resource management, and then 4 months maybe doing some law enforcement kinds of activities. It might be just checking gates, cave gates, and other things. And from that, it worked pretty well for a while, but then a Superintendent David Mahalik come in here in the about 1988, and he wanted to form a resource management division, which is what he did. Now that included both natural and cultural resources. So we have, which is a major divide here sometimes where you're trying to look at protecting natural resources, but at the same time you've got cultural resources that are on the ground that also deserve the same protection. Sometimes there's conflicts, and we have that. So my interaction as the head of that division is also with many things. I mean, you might be looking at ecology, you might be looking at hydrology. There's it goes into plants. So you might have botanists, exotic species that are invading the park. All these things are here, and we have staff to work through those kinds of things. We also have a cultural side that we have to be very cognizant of. So this building that we're in today is a CCC structure, so it's eligible for National Historic Register. So we have to work with maintenance. So when repairs need to be made to these things, there's certain ways you can do this and certain ways you can't. So you have to be very careful about how that's done. We have archaeology. There's rich archaeology here, going back 5,000 years, in the park itself. But there's also other cultural layers here. The period of time when we started the mining operations from around the War of 1812 period. So there's artifacts of that landscape. And then once those periods over, then you've got this period where it's a cave tour operation. There's a hotel here. They're operating cave tours on their own up until the time that the park is being thought about. And then you have a Mammoth Cave operating committee that sort of manages the park for some period of time. So there's that landscape. Then you have the CCC landscape, all the things they did. Then you have the Mission 66 landscape. And then you have this landscape today. So all these things have to be considered on the cultural scale.
Historical, cultural, meaning both everything you laid out historically, but also contemporary, modern.
And in the communities that lived here. This This was an assemblage of many small towns and small farms. So there's churches, over 100 cemeteries on the park. Some of them as small as 1 or 2 graves, others much, much larger. So we have that consideration to look at. We have lots of people that were displaced, from this park that still live in the surrounding area. Now they're not, they're descendants of those people in most cases, but at the same time they remember their parents talking about living here or their grandparents being here. So there's still that local tie. So you've got to be sensitive to those kinds of things. When people want to come to visit a grave or come into to a church, or the 3 churches we still have here. So it's a balancing act is the way I see we have to do here to it's man in the landscape here. So we have to consider when we're either doing some compliance activities, for instance, where a project may need to be undertaken. In a case of like a cave trail project where we want to rehabilitate the entire cave trail, it's a challenge because you've got that trail was laid down by the Civilian Conservation Corps, so you've got to be careful how we preserve that. But yet at the same time we want to keep that trail where people can safely walk on it, and that we maintain the integrity of the resources that are just inches off trail. But we want to keep that preserved for the enjoyment of future generations. And there's no lack of things to do, and collaboration and coordination too. So interpretation is the same way. So in my division as well, one of the other things we need to do is we have tremendous amounts of science underway. Trying to understand whether it be the exotic species that may be invading the park, or whether it be bats that are now contracting white nose syndrome. So we have lots of research that's underway. We may have air quality research, we have water quality research. We're trying to understand the hydrology of the cave system, as it's both inside and outside the park that may be impacting here. All this information can feed into the interpretation, needs to feed into the interpretation division. So we have both a learning center, an environmental education program, and interpretation, as well as my division as well. We have a component of that where we try to take the research that we're learning and be able to provide that information to the interpretation division so they can better understand it. And that's both for natural and cultural information. A classic example.
Sorry. A classic example.
A classic example of that kind of thing is recently there was an incident where we had a tour of people that was going down an old cave tour trail, it's called Gothic Avenue. Many stone walls that were placed up there. There was stories that we used to tell that the old guides for the 1800s, they needed to get a cave trail constructed. So it was a neat thing for them to tell people actually they would pay for a cave trail and go in the cave, and one of your benefits of paying for this cave trip is, guess what, you may be able to build a monument to yourself or to your organization. Well, that helped them get the cave trail developed, cleaned off a little bit of some debris of rock and stuff, so they would stack these rocks up on the trail and see them. Recently, a trail goes past, they accidentally bumped into a rock, and it created a little bit of a rock slide. And out of that rock slide came a newspaper from 1898. That was from a German community up in Louisville. And this is information we've since learned from after we got the paper and had it. We're trying to have it restored now. But through some research, turns that there was a lot of German immigrants, obviously, into this part of the country, and so there was this 1860s community that were German speaking, and they needed a newspaper so they could understand what was going on. So they had this daily paper, and so by the 1870s, they started. Now their children were speaking English. And so they didn't need the German paper so much, but the older folks still did. So they had a weekend kind of edition that went weekend. So this was one of those, at least mid versions of the Sunday paper that these folks would have. And so someone,
It was in between them.
It was in between, stuck in one of these little monuments. And so that's the kind of stuff. We're now have that piece of, and so we're studying that, and we're going to actually do a little presentation. Some folks from our curatorial division, and let everybody know a little bit about that. So that's the kind of information we'll share with interpretation, and it's a great little story for them to tell visitors.
Well, you've seen a lot of different communities because you've been based in Denver, and I think you said from the Virgin Islands to Denali.
Yes, coast to coast.
And I'm also thinking you have a sentimental tie to here, Ohio County, growing up. Right. I've also been told by your colleagues that every park they've worked at has its own characteristics, and how might this be different? Or you've been explaining the landscape was cultural and biological, ecological. Does every park have that if you dig deep enough? I
think they do. Every place I would go to, there is a passion about every park. I mean, it's one of those things. I love it. If you try to go to a new park, you don't just spend a whole lot of time there, but you do spend some time there, and you'll find that the people that the National Park Service employees they have there are as passionate about their resources as we are here at Mammoth Cave. We'll go. You can go to training sessions around the country. And you'll have 13 or 14 parks represented, and you'll find that there's just tremendous amounts of passion about these parks and their preservation, and for the enjoyment of future generations that want to come here. And I just think that's something you just don't find everywhere else in any other working environment.
Just for the park system.
For the park system, yes.
Did it change when we got World Heritage status, meaning Mammoth Cave? Mm-hmm. And I can't remember what year that was. Was that?
Yeah, that was 1981. That we became World Heritage.
Yeah, so you were here.
Yes, and it was obviously we have always had a little bit of an international flavor here, at the park. I mean, as a matter of fact, if you look at the hotel registers and they go back 200 years, you'll see that there has always been sort of an influence of just foreign visitation here. I think or at least if you consider what we consider ourselves in the caving community, there is a worldwide tie to each other, and you'll find this I think in a lot of just the cave types of parks. Carlsbad or Mammoth Cave, or if you look at the caves of Slovenia and other caves across in Europe and other locations, there is this international tie to the caving community. I mean, we have an organization that called the Cave Research Foundation, which makes up it's just volunteer folks that work with that love to cave, and for our purposes. We have an agreement for their assistance in helping to map our cave. That's how we know it's over 400 miles long now, is from basically their work. But the Cave Research Foundation expands beyond just Mammoth. It's in just every cave system that you can imagine. They're in. They like to explore caves. That's what they do. That's their passion. So I think there's that tie globally. Just with other cave units, because we have may not be the same species of bat, but we have bats. We have resources to protect inside caves. There's some have tremendous amounts of formations or other things. So we tend to have a lot of cultural artifacts and not maybe as many formations, but we do have some areas of the cave that have lots of formations that are special. In those kind of terms. So I feel like there's that kind of tie to the to World Heritage, and I know the World Heritage designation, I think interestingly enough, did not include a lot of the cultural issues that you might think, but more towards the natural, the cave the cave issues that you might run into. So.
I was talking with some law enforcement colleagues of yours about how they've increasingly worked collaboratively with other law enforcement outside of, themselves. Maybe it's local sheriffs or it's federal folks, and being helpful on both ways. And you mentioned like the Cave Research Association and how they've added to our knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
How about other, particularly in your area of science?
Right.
What other kind of do you also partner? Is it with Western Kentucky University because it's close, or statewide, or can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, we have lots and lots of cooperative agreements that we work, because we couldn't do it. We couldn't cover all the areas we need to cover, whether it be archaeology or whether it be trying to understand cave beetles or bat species. There's just so much to do that we could not get this done without the help of our partners from either Western Kentucky University, the University of Kentucky. You could just about name a lot. There's been some university tie here from a lot of Murray State, Eastern Kentucky University, especially locally. Vanderbilt has been involved, University of Tennessee. We have called on those partners. A lot of times those partners have called on us to let us say we're willing to help, and or might have a project they have that is of interest to us. It could be the state has been a huge help, from the standpoint of mussel diversity and biology and other things that we need to study and work on. We have endangered mussels in our river, and we could not study those without the assistance of the state of Kentucky and some universities, University of Louisville and other places have been able to help us with that research. And otherwise, that's just an extension of our division. I look at it that way, that we're all in this thing together, and it's going to take all of us to pull, to understand it and protect it.
Mm-hmm. I just lost my train of thought.
Well, one other point, I want to say this too. We also, one of the things we try to do is obviously just preserve and protect this park unit, but we also rely on other federal agencies. There's a huge amount of, we're not a regulatory agency. We have, some authority over the lands that we administer, and we try to do our best there. But this is a global situation, where you're, either be air quality, which you're looking at the transport of pollutants that can come from many miles. It can come, from the Yucatan Peninsula, for instance, when they're burning, the place they do a lot of agricultural burning. We've seen situations where ash is falling out of the sky here, so we're getting the impacts from that volcanic activity, explosions. You'll see that fire that takes place out on the plains of the U.S. and it makes it all the way to here. We get smoke impacts that deal with increased levels of ozone, particulate matter, other things that can have an effect upon our sensitive resources, whether it be soils or vegetation or waters, those kind of things. So we need great assistance from the Environmental Protection Agency, the various Kentucky divisions, air, water, geologic resources. We really tie into those guys. Other federal agencies like the USGS, the U.S. Geologic Survey, who help us with water quality measurements, just looking at the river, looking at the streams, those kinds of things that we need their help from. The various forest services, either state, federal, that's helping us with looking at invasive species that may be coming in here. We're looking at emerald ash borers, potential impact to our ash trees. So we're helping us with monitoring for those kinds of things, or the woolly adelgid, if you're thinking about the hemlock. We have a very isolated stand of hemlock here in the park that's separated from the Appalachians. So we'll take much to lose that stand if we don't kind of do vigilance on looking for those species that come across the landscape. So there's a tremendous amount of work I don't want, I can't mention everybody, but I mean the work that the University of Kentucky is helping us with on our bat research associated with white nose syndrome has been huge. They're here, I admire all the work they do. They're here in the middle of the night trying to trap bats to look at them, get their, how good, what kind of shape they're in. It's just amazing the level of effort and the passion our researchers bring. I think it's equal to the passion that we have for this park, and I think that passion is out there across the country.
That's great. How about your work into the future? I mean, I'm not sure how long I was talking to Vicki, and I can't remember if you have like a retirement plan and how far away that is, but what do you hope your colleagues or the people that are coming after you can do?
Well, and that's been my, I view myself, it's hard to imagine this already, because I can remember my first day like it was last week. I remember the people you meet and those kinds of things, but I'm in the twilight, obviously. But my goal is you want to leave somewhere, you want to leave things in better condition than you find them. And that's been my, for the 2 years I have been Chief of Science Resource Management. That's one thing that we've needed to kind of move toward, is some planning for the long term. And so I view my role as that. I'm trying to establish just some planning documents that we're looking at, trying to understand what are our desired future conditions. What do you want the water, the streams to look like? What do you want the trails to look like? What do you want the forest diversity to look like? So as part of that, I'm spending a lot of my time trying to get natural resource condition assessments. We're trying to get that done. We need a cultural resource condition assessment. We're trying to we're working on a foundation document that kind of sort of states like a general management plan, if you will, from the early years. It sort of tells who you are, and the natural resource condition assessment kind of gives you an idea of where you've come from, what have you studied to this point. But and then we need to, I want to move towards a resource stewardship strategy, which tells us now where do we take all this to, and I think it just will help so much in our planning. We don't have a cave management plan, and it's kind of interesting. You think of a park, the longest cave in the world. We should probably have a cave management plan. About every other cave does. We don't, and so we're starting those kind of processes up. So I think in these times they're lean economically, but at the same time it's a great opportunity to plan for what you can do when economic conditions improve and funding is available. And so so I guess I look at myself as we're trying to create a roadmap to the future, and that's what I hope that someday somebody can look back and they think, what was this guy thinking about? But I hope it shows up in some of that planning.
That's great. Do you have any final thoughts?
Well, looking back, I often think about those first days. When you're there's a few things I'm working on. I can remember those first days coming here. We had fire. We had like a fire control officer, and his name was Lloyd Cook. My first day here, he was in his 35th year, which is about where I'm at today. I'm 38 years, but or 37, almost working on 38. And I just recall him, and I thought often, that he was a bridge to the beginning of the park. He worked for the CCCs, and here I am, and he was giving me all of this information. That my goodness, I wished I'd stopped to listen to a little bit more of it. Because I realize now, I try to remember what some of the things Lloyd would tell me about or Mr. Cook actually would tell me about what was going on here. And because right now I would love to have Lloyd standing right next to me so I could ask him, what was this about? Why did this happen? Or why did this, why didn't you do this? There's planning documents that say you're going to go this direction, and why? And I think about those early days, and it was, and then here I am. I'm at that point. I'm at kind of the end of my career, but at the same time, I just love this park, and I love what it's about and the people here. And I'm hoping that I'm trying to do that same thing with folks that are starting out. They're in their first. Trying to do a little of some mentoring, and I think we all need to do that. I don't think we do enough of it. I think we tend to think that, sometimes when you're trying to mentor other people, you kind of get that feeling like, here goes this old man going on and on again about something that happened 30 years ago. But trying to instill in that it's important that you know where you came from, so you can know where you're going to go. And I think that's something I just like to leave. And I've just certainly enjoyed it. And I'm going to rue the day that I have to walk out the door and turn in my keys and my badge. But at the same time, I'll look at it with fondness for all the people. And that's what it's all been about. It's the people you meet and the people that you're trying to let the visitors that come to the park know that this park is special and we're taking care of.